Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. 15 years ago this month, the United States, in its so-called coalition of the willing, illegally invaded and occupied Iraq. American troops remain there to this day, and Iraq continues to grapple with that fateful decision. Many call the invasion of Iraq a blunder. Shouldn't we call it what it really is? A crime. Cross-talking Iraq 15 years on, I'm joined by my guest, Ken O'Keefe in Calgary. He is a political analyst and an ex-U.S. Marine who renounced U.S. citizenship. In Washington, we have Christopher Neiweem. He is a former Army military police sergeant, Iraq War veteran, and contributor to The Hill. And in Tehran, we have Mohammed Marandi. He's an associate professor at the University of Tehran. All right, gentlemen, cross-talk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. All right, gentlemen, before we get started here, I'd like to refresh everybody's memory of what happened 15 years ago preceding the war, and also because the mainstream media is largely ignoring this 15-year commemoration, because it's certainly not an anniversary here. Let me read a few things here. I believe demolishing Hussein's military power and liberating Iraq would be a cakewalk. That was Keith Edelman. The conflict could last 6 days, 6 weeks. I doubt 6 months. Donald Rumsfeld. We will be greeted as liberators. Dick Cheney. A year from now, I wouldn't be surprised that there's some grand square in Baghdad named after President Bush, Richard Pearl. Iraq will not require sustained aid, Mitch Daniels. And lastly, but really importantly, we're dealing with a country that can really finance its own reconstruction, and relatively soon, Paul Wolfowitz. All right, Ken, let me go to you first here. I mean, what has been learned from this fiasco for everybody involved? And why isn't it being commemorated and remembered? It seems like it's intentionally being blocked out. Go ahead, Ken.
Well, let's remember the 22 American service members a day that are committing suicide because they were sent off to fight an illegal, immoral war that was based on a pack of lies. And ultimately, what we've learned is that international law is not functioning because of all the things we were told about Adolf Hitler. Apparently, according to the Nuremberg principles, the supreme crime that he committed was war of aggression, because all the other crimes, torture, mass murder, crimes against humanity, all of those stem from war of aggression. So only when Tony Blair and George Bush and a whole host of others, including Rumsfeld and Cheney, are sitting in a jail cell for the rest of their lives can we begin to think that this world has turned from the better. Until such time, apparently we haven't learned much, because this crime that we have committed is one of the greatest crimes of the 21st century. And I personally, having been to Iraq and having visited Baghdad and met the orphans that are there, millions of orphans, millions of refugees, probably close to 2 million dead, at least 1 million dead, the country is still wreaking havoc over its entire system has been destroyed infrastructure-wise. All of this is one of the major crimes of the 21st century, and nobody in any position of power has suffered the consequences, which tells me that international law is not functioning, and that means that we must change that circumstance, and people need to be put in jail for life.
Okay, Christopher, you're an Iraq War veteran here. I mean, when I look at a lot of the people that were the architects of this war, I mean, some of these people are in the Trump administration now. And so Ken already brought up the issue of accountability. I mean, this is a catastrophe of almost unbelievable magnitude. But and not only these architects, but people in the media that cheered on this war like they cheer on so many other foreign adventures. How do you reflect upon that, Christopher? You were there. Go ahead.
I was. It's hard to believe how much time has gone by. It's been a very, very long time. I remember I was 19 years old coming into theater in Kuwait and then through Iraq, and I remember it's very personal. Many of the veterans I serve with have lost legs, lost eyes. It's been very personal. So I actually appreciate Ken's perspective on the VA and what veterans are dealing with out there. And I would admit that some of the arrogance that came out of the sort of tone and tenor of some Bush folks back then about the ease of it, it's been very personal for me. But I do want to push back a little bit in the sense of this notion that it's illegal or the illegality. If we look back at UN security resolutions dating back to 1990 and forward, the security resolutions that were passed to give, to compel Iraq to comply with weapons inspections and to give that authorization. And if you look back, I mean, 72% of Americans, Gallup poll, the United States Congress, many of the people, and I would ask Ken if he would agree, were, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, U.S. lawmakers that voted for that war authorization, that use of force. So I think we have to look back at the time where people's minds were at in the post-9/11 environment, and I would point to those international security resolutions as the authorization that was cited for the invasion.
Well, Christopher, there are other countries in the world that don't abide by United Nations Security Council resolutions. Israel is a prime example, okay? Let me go to Mohammed here. I think it is patently obvious that the war was illegal because there was no United Nations Security Council resolution, okay? And I'd be willing to admit that Iraq did not fulfill probably every single resolution, but that's not a cause for war, okay? Go ahead, Mohammed.
I think it's even worse than that. First of all, I think it was even if the UN Security Council had voted for them to launch this war, it still would have been illegal. The United States was the regime that created the monster Saddam Hussein. They helped create the war machine that Saddam Hussein used to invade Kuwait, for example, and to invade Iran. The United States and its European allies, the so-called civilized world, they gave Saddam Hussein chemical weapons. They used chemical weapons, the Iraqis, with the support of the United States. Halabja, the Kurdish city in northern Iraq, almost 7,000 people were killed, 6,800, I believe, as a result of chemical weapons that Saddam Hussein used with the support of the West. I personally survived 2 chemical attacks. So these were crimes against humanity that the United States bears as much responsibility as Saddam Hussein. After that, when the United States imposed sanctions on the Iraqi people after the defeat of the Saddam forces in Kuwait, 1 million people were killed. And Madeleine Albright back then said it was a price worth paying. 1 million children died as a result.
Yeah.
And also, after Iraq was defeated in Kuwait, the Iraqis rose up, and they were about to overthrow the regime, and then the United States allowed the regime to use its helicopters to massacre Iraqis both in the north and the south of the country. Scowcroft and people like Haas, they were saying that the regime must stay in place because its overthrow may benefit Iran. So the United States kept Saddam Hussein in power all these years. They have no moral legitimacy to carry out any war. And the war was based on lies.
Right, and they certainly did.
The chemical weapons, the nuclear weapons, the aluminum tubes, the yellow cake from Niger, all that fabricated evidence. And the reason why Americans supported it was because the corporate media and state-owned media like the BBC, they're all behind
because they were lied to.
Okay, well, go ahead, jump in there, Ken, because this is my mantra all the time about this, because you have the media as just stenographers for power. And again, and one of the reasons why I want to make this program is that we're seeing it all over again. We saw it with Syria. We're seeing it with Iran is being targeted right now. It's the same techniques. It's the same people doing it. Go ahead, Ken.
And it's the same people in charge. And if we want to learn something, if the audience wants to learn something, then let's look at Oded Yanan's strategy for Israel in the 1980s. There is this psychopathic plan for Israel to expand. And back in the 1980s, Saddam Hussein was identified as target number 1, while, by the way, he was our asset fighting the Iranians, which Brother Mohammed knows very well, because Saddam Hussein was used to kill effectively 1 million Iranians, which included teenage boys who were sent off to the front, who came voluntarily to the front to defend Iran very honorably, the only war that Iran has been involved in for several centuries. Ultimately, this plan of expanding Israel, the Greater Israel Project, involved not just the taking out of Saddam Hussein or any other strong Arab leadership in the region, but also to effectively balkanize the entire region. And what we see right now in Syria, Libya, and the entire region is that plan, Oded Yanan's strategy for Israel in the 1980s. And this chaos that we see is not an accident. And if people really want to learn something here, they need to understand that none of this is an accident. Actually, what's happened in Iraq is exactly what was intended. Not only to take out Saddam Hussein, but to break up Iraq, which we see 3 different segments. We see the same thing happening in Syria right now. So if people really want to have an understanding, they need to know that those that are in power, which are all basically puppets in government, who are underneath the bankers who always want war, who finance generally all sides of war, they have a major incentive to keep going with war. And now you know very well, sitting there in Russia, that we're trying to pick a fight with Russia. And look at the embarrassing reality of UK politics with Boris Johnson and the Prime Minister themselves indicting Russia without any evidence whatsoever.
Yeah.
Why? Because they work for the bankers and another war is on order.
Okay, that's the pattern, you know, accuse and then you don't need any kind of evidence here. Christopher, let me ask you almost kind of like a personal question. I mean, a lot has come out about the planning and the botched occupation. You know, the Iraqi government, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, voted to have all foreign troops removed from Iraq. But the United States doesn't do that. I thought, you know, the United States was trying to give sovereignty to Iraq, and it doesn't even listen to its own, the political system that it actually imposed. You know, isn't it time for the U.S. to stop, quote unquote, helping the Iraqis? Go ahead, Christopher.
Well, I think that, I mean, President Bush campaign, we weren't going to have nation building, and then we had nation building on steroids. I mean, I think it'd be fair to look back at that. But I think the biggest issues with with Iraq was not so much the initial invasion, but it was all of the post-war activities, whether it was the disagreement between the Pentagon and the administration over troop levels, decommissioning the Iraqi military, and frankly, just the post-war governance. I think that's where the problem's head. If Iraq was a flourishing democracy today, I think maybe we'd be looking at it differently, but I think it's more the way that it turned out that's causing those issues. But I do want to say it's a very long, complex history. I don't disagree at all with the contradictory foreign policy positions over the last 50 years of the United States in these areas. I can easily see why it's looked at with a certain amount of disdain.
Let me jump in here, gentlemen. We have to go to a hard break, and after that hard break, we'll continue our discussion on Iraq. 15 years on. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing Iraq, 15 years on. Okay, let me go back to Tehran. Mohammed, one of the ironies of the law of unintended consequences, probably my favorite phrase when I look at American foreign policy in the Middle East, is that 15 years on after this, I will continue with the illegal invasion and occupation, is that this is a neocon's nightmare because of that blunder, failure, even crime, is that you have a government in Baghdad that doesn't look to Washington, it looks to Tehran. So, I mean, the unintended consequence couldn't be more overstated. Go ahead, Mohammed.
I think the reason for that is that the United States never was looking to create any democracy in Iraq, just like it's not looking to create democracy anywhere else. It's basically in the region to keep its hegemony intact. The United States supports Saudi Arabia, the regime that has been exporting Wahhabism across the world, the ideology of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and they have no problem with that. In the case of Iraq, the United States thought that they could overthrow the country. They could scare their own people. If you remember the dossier and the 45 minutes where they were claiming that Saddam Hussein could, the Sun and the Daily Star in England were saying we could be attacked in 45 minutes. And then Kelly, he revealed information that this was all nonsense, and he ultimately committed suicide, or he died somehow. If we recall all these, and the younger generation recalls how the United States prepared the public and created fear in the West so that they could attack this country. It was basically through fear, through lies, they attacked the country, they destroyed the country, and they were hoping that they could plunder the country. They could start exporting Iraqi oil and make up for any losses that they had as a result of the attack. And the problem is that the Iraqi people, they were freed from Saddam Hussein, and they did not like the occupation either. And they wanted better relations with Iran. And the very fact that an elected government in Iraq wants good relations with Iran is something sinful to the Americans. They say that this is the Iranian presence in Iraq. No, it's normal relations that have been established between two neighboring countries. Yet the Americans cannot tolerate that. So I think the whole problem is that the United States, how it presents itself to the world, is that it's a democracy, that it promotes democracy, but in reality, it is a regime that is only trying to preserve its own interests. It is Orientalist, the culture of the political regime in the United States and in Europe. They're Orientalist. That's why the Saudis can kill hundreds of thousands of people through starvation and disease in Yemen, and no one in Europe will care. No one in Europe will be ashamed of the war crimes that their governments are being carried out because they're Yemenis. They're not white Europeans.
Right.
The same is true in Libya. The same is true in Afghanistan, and so on.
And Ken, reflect upon that because there is no reflection and taking of responsibility for what has happened in Iraq, and that assures the same strategy will be applied again. And I'm thinking, of course, all of us are thinking about Iran. The same mechanisms are in place. The lack of democracy in Iran. They never mention the fact that there is a democracy in Iran, and it's an Islamic democracy. It's what the Iranian people seem to be content with. But Saudi Arabia, the closest ally, one of the closest allies of the United States in the Middle East, has no democracy whatsoever. We never hear about that. But Iran will be targeted for democracy change, when they already have it. I mean, again, the American people are so grossly uninformed. Go ahead, Ken.
There's a couple of points that need to be made here. One, the war crimes and crimes against humanity cannot be overstated. In Fallujah, they are advising women not to have children because we use so much depleted uranium, white phosphorus, which is a chemical weapon, and other experimental weapons, that the area is so toxic that the birth defect rates have gone through the roof, child cancers. And if you've ever seen the pictures of these depleted uranium babies, and you know what the definition of crime against humanity is, it is disgusting and criminal beyond description. The other point that needs to be made, that while Saddam Hussein was in power, there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq. In fact, Saddam Hussein would have been the first one to execute anyone who would have been found to be linked to Al-Qaeda. And then if we're to believe the official version of history after the occupation, we're supposed to believe that this ISIS creation, which is a creation of Western intelligence agencies, we're supposed to believe that all of a sudden all these Humvees and all these American weapons just accidentally fell into the hands of ISIS, which wreaked havoc, cutting off heads all over that region, all over Iraq. We're supposed to believe that that was an accident. All the while, as Mohammed has mentioned and you've just mentioned, our best friend and ally in Saudi Arabia, which, by the way, is an extension of Israel, Saudi Arabia, the exporter of all of that Wahhabi doctrine, which is the seedbed of ISIS, is our best friend and ally. So we created the context in which ISIS was created, and ISIS has wreaked havoc, and it was never a popular movement at all. Every genuine Muslim knows damn well that ISIS is an affront to Islam, and even in Basra, on a yearly basis, last year, was it reported in the Western media at all that there was about 20 million Muslims who protested and demonstrated against ISIS and were making clear that ISIS has nothing to do with genuine Islam? We created that, and again I say that's not an accident. The creation of ISIS is not an accident. We know that Al-Qaeda is the CIA database. That was not an accident. These are the Frankensteins that Western intelligence agencies and Mossad create in order to justify our policies in the region, which are basically to destroy that entire region, to balkanize that region so that ultimately Israel can expand. The American government is bought and paid for by Israel. And it couldn't be more obvious. Netanyahu's 3 visits to the U.S. Congress, where these sycophants, traitors in the U.S. Congress, sit there and give him 29 standing ovations, tells you everything about who owns the U.S. Congress, which is nothing but a den of traitors.
Christopher, reflect upon, 15 years on. I mean, how is the United States moved forward with its interest in the region? Because it seems to me that particularly since the end of the Cold War, just about everything the U.S. does in the Middle East backfires, blows up in its face, and just leaves in its wake chaos. I mean, I'm always, asking the question, where is the learning curve? Because I don't see any of it here, unless it's intentional, as our other guests have said, is just to sow chaos. Is that in the interest of the United States and the American people, and spending so much on the military for that? Go ahead, Christopher.
Well, I think that the other problem is the U.S. never gets credit for the good it does. I mean, that's another issue that's perennial, is the grass. I mean, the fact is, first of all, the U.S. gives Israel money, not the other way around. So if anything, it should be the other way around in that particular example. But the bottom line is, when it comes to
that's because the U.S.
Iraq,
government is owned by Israel. That's why we give them that money.
Ken, hold on.
Keep going, Christopher. Keep going. Keep going, Christopher.
Ken, you got your 10 minutes. Look, the bottom line is, in the crimes against humanity, we completely forgot about Saddam Hussein kidnapping people, gassing their own people, his son running around like a total crime family. And then in the instance of the idea that Iran is some flourishing democracy, imagine here in the States if the Trump administration had appointees in Congress, in the judiciary, where the entire government, it's all the clerics, every single branch of government is completely occupied by the religious thinkers.
Christopher, I think you're a good person, and I think your heart's in the right place, but why is it the responsibility of the United States to be determining what kind of political culture is in a foreign country halfway around the world? Okay, I mean, the United States has the highest incarceration level in the world. Why don't maybe the U.S. should work on that, or its opiate crisis? I don't see. The thing is, this whole approach looks.
Well, we're a nation of 320 million people. It's a totally different statistical game.
You look for virtue in things. I don't, because I think that has nothing to do with politics. Okay.
And I also, this is crosstalk, Peter. You do invite people to chime in, so I'm going to chime in here.
Go.
You try and tell the Iraqi people who've lost 1 million to 2 million, the millions of orphans. I've met orphans in Baghdad who lost both parents. They have nothing. So don't you dare tell me, and never mind me, don't you dare tell the people of Iraq the good that the United States has done. Lives have been destroyed. What if it was your child who was blown to bits? Would you say, oh, well, they did help us take out a brutal
Ken,
dictator, which, by the way, the United States supported through all of his worst crimes. Through all of his worst crimes, the United States supported Saddam Hussein. So please don't tell me we care about the rights of the people there.
Christopher, reply.
Well, I mean, I was there in 2003, Ken. I don't know if you were, but the bottom line is, we're building roads, we're feeding people. I was there, and I've seen the real effect of war. And okay, great. In 2003? In 2003, you were in Iraq?
Yes, I was, before the invasion. And I came back a year later. And
before
I saw it. Are you telling me we built roads, so that makes killing 1 million to 2 million
regardless,
okay?
Have you covered the Iraqi crime family, Uday, Hussein, and all of that? You didn't touch anything on that. See, it's always one-dimensional. The U.S., if at some point, if Iraq and their people don't want to run with the opportunity they had, that's on them.
We supported Saddam Hussein.
May I?
We supported Saddam Hussein through all of his worst crimes.
Gentlemen, we're rapidly running out of time. I want to go to Mohammed in Tehran.
We also forgot about 1991, but
go ahead
later.
Mohammed.
Look, I think the problem is that your guest doesn't recognize that Saddam Hussein, again, as I said earlier, was created with the help of the United States. When he gassed his own people, he did it with U.S. support. He did it with European support. The only time this became an issue was after Saddam invaded Kuwait. The United States has done no favors to the Iraqi people. The destruction of Iraq for the last 40 years was because of the United States. As I said, you were alluding to 1991. In 1991, when the Iraqi people, after the regime lost its battle in Kuwait, they rose up against the regime. And the Americans prevented Saddam Hussein from collapsing. They allowed him to use despite the no-fly zone, they allowed him to use his helicopters.
Unfortunately, gentlemen, we have run out of time. We've run out of time. Fascinating topic here. Many thanks to my guests in Calgary, Washington, and in Tehran. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.